Special thank you to my patrons for helping make this video happen. The state of Texas has always been a little football crazy. On the professional level, on the college level, on the high school level, hell, I'm sure on the Pee-wee level too. Texas just loves the sport of American football. And in the mid-20th century, in a suburb outside of Fort Worth, that love would spawn one of the sport's greatest strategic innovations. The history of the Wishbone offense is fairly contentious, but every origin begins in Texas. The earliest claimant is one Charles Spud Kaysen, head coach of the William Monig Junior High from 1952 to 1973. He would run a juggernaut of a junior high program, going undefeated for over half of his 21 years with the Mustangs, partially due to a strange, home-cooked offense Kaysen called the Monig T, a modification of the base T formation that moved the fullback closer to the line of scrimmage, initially to accommodate a slower fullback, but it would see widespread use across Texas high schools due to its ability to provide good blocking angles. This would be the backbone of what would eventually become the Wishbone, but it still lacked a key component of the offensive formation it would eventually evolve into. A component born from a coach on the hot seat. Houston's Bill Yeoman, since being hired by the Cougars in 1962, is 12-22-1 throughout 3.5 seasons. His offensive line simply isn't strong enough to compete against the rest of the Southwest Conference. Yeoman needed an element of trickery to bring his offense and head coaching career back from the brink. What he came up with was the Houston Veer, making use of a quarterback's ability to either pitch the ball to two of his halfbacks or keep it himself, depending on how he read the opposing defense. Houston's crafty Veer would begin to dominate the teams it had once been pummeled by, going from the nation's 65th highest scoring offense in 1965 to second in 66, fifth in 67, and number one in 1968, averaging 42.5 points per game. An average that included a 100-6 victory over Tulsa, FBS football's last 100-point game. Through the development of the Monig T and the Houston Veer, a certain Texas high school coach by the name of Emory Bellard would begin formulating his own offense, mixing the fullback placement of the Monig T with the triple option capabilities of the Houston Veer. He began work on what would eventually become the Wishbone. In 1967, Darrell Royal's Texas Longhorns were having their worst season in a decade, and the blame fell squarely on the offense. Finishing the year averaging 18.6 points per game, scoring less than 20 in 6 of their 10 games, Royal's decade-defining program had grinded to a halt. It's midway through this disappointing 1967 season where Royal would reach out to San Angelo Central High School's head coach, Emory Bellard, to offer him a place on his coaching staff. First as a linebackers coach before being promoted to offensive coordinator prior to the 68 season. Bellard's Wishbone would see its first use on the college level on September 21st, facing off against the Houston Veer that partially inspired it. The Longhorns would tie the 11th-ranked Cougars 20-20, before dropping their next game against Texas Tech 21-31. Then, Royal, Bellard, and their Longhorn program won 30 games in a row, riding the nation's 7th, 5th, and 1st highest scoring offense in 68, 69, and 1970 respectively. The Wishbone would immediately bring Texas back to competing for national titles, winning the Southwest Conference all 3 years of their 30-game winning streak, going 2-1 the Cotton Bowl, and winning national titles in 1969 and 1970. The Wishbone was seemingly unstoppable. That is, until a high school coach in Maine solved it. Phil Dawson, head coach of the Westbrook Blue Blazes, would develop a defense that put a pair of inverted safeties on each of the opposing team's halfbacks with the intent of mirroring their movement, thus shutting down 2 of the Wishbone's 3 options. Dawson's defense would eventually be called the backbone or mirror defense, and soon after its development, Dawson would hand it over to Notre Dame head coach Ara Parseghian, set to face off against the Longhorns in the 1971 Cotton Bowl. Notre Dame would come out on top, ending Royals' 30-game winning streak by holding the nation's most prolific offense to a mere 11 points. The Wishbone had finally been bested, and alterations of the base formation would soon be made. The basis for these alterations were rather simple: the moving of one or both of the offense's halfbacks across the backfield to quote-unquote break the base Wishbone, providing both a wider range of motions and making it more difficult for a defense to accurately mirror their movements. This would become the base of what would become known as the broken bone, frequently used by none other than Emory Bellard, especially during his time as Mississippi State's head coach in the late 70s. Despite Notre Dame's attempts, the formation found new life in its evolution, and the golden age of the Wishbone had only just begun. In 1970, Bear Bryant's Alabama was in a historic slump, beginning the year with a beatdown so bad it may or may not have ended segregation in college football. The once feared Crimson Tide would finish the season unranked and barely above 500. And while their offensive output wasn't 1967 Longhorns bad, it was clear they too needed to shake some things up to make their return to the top of college football. So, Bryant met with a personal friend of his, Texas head coach Darrell Royal, and with the help of Emory Bellard and the rest of the Longhorns' offensive staff, Bear Bryant was given the keys to the Wishbone. Working hand in hand with the desegregation of the Alabama football program, Bryant's final 12 years with the Crimson Tide would prove to be some of his best, winning 9 of 12 SEC titles, 3 national titles, and winning 10 or more games 9 of his last 12 seasons, in part due to the adoption of the Wishbone. While Texas would serve as the Wishbone's birthplace, the formation would be perfected 5.5 hours north in Norman, Oklahoma. The Sooner offense of 1971 was arguably the greatest rushing offense of all time, all thanks to the Wishbone and their 6th-year offensive coordinator Barry Switzer, second in the nation in points per game at 41.2, while averaging 422 rushing yards per game, 6.8 rushing yards per attempt, and a whopping 63.3 rushing attempts per game, all while averaging just above 6 pass attempts per game. It was, on its face, as one-dimensional as an offense gets, yet it dominated through the wrinkles built into the formation and built upon by Switzer. Every play had 1 or more fakeouts, 1 or more laterals, 1 or more ball carriers, all in a 60-minute game of hot potato that kept opposing defenses guessing. Barry Switzer would succeed Oklahoma's Chuck Fairbanks as head coach in 1973, continuing to use and build upon the Wishbone for the majority of his tenure in Norman, to enormous success. 12 Big 8 titles, including 7 in a row from 1972 to 79, and 3 national titles in 1974, 1975, and finally in 1985. The same year, another disciple of the Wishbone hit their stride. Fisher DeBerry began his college coaching career under Jim Brakefield, serving as his assistant coach at both Wofford and Appalachian State throughout the late 60s and 70s, largely helping to run their Wishbone-heavy offenses. His efforts would eventually land him a job in Colorado Springs, first as Air Force's QB coach before being promoted to offensive coordinator in 1981. It's here where DeBerry would help pioneer an alteration of the Wishbone that moved the 2 halfbacks up to the line of scrimmage, while keeping a fullback behind the quarterback. This is the basis of what would become the Flexbone, and in 1985, a newly promoted Fisher DeBerry would use it to create one of the greatest service academy teams since the end of the Second World War. The Air Force Falcons would finish with both the nation's 3rd highest scoring offense and best record at 12-1. With their only loss coming from the defending national champion BYU Cougars. Where DeBerry's Flexbone shined, though, true to the name, was its flexibility, highlighted by starting quarterback Bart Weiss. Not only did he average nearly 14 rushing attempts per game at an average of 5.7 yards per attempt, as would be expected from a triple option quarterback, He also averaged nearly 11 passing attempts per game at an average of 10.3 yards per attempt. It was still primarily a run-first offense, yet it still opened up the passing game when need be. The Flexbone would soon spread to the rest of the service academies, finding a permanent home among the permanently undersized rosters of Army and Navy, just as the traditional Wishbone began to fade away. Barry Switzer would begin pivoting away from the Wishbone in the early 80s, a transition he'd complete by resigning from the Sooners in the midst of scandal and NCAA probation. Alabama would hold firm for much of the 80s, even after Bear Bryant's retirement in 1982, but eventually the tide too would move on. The sport of college football had drastically changed from the ground and pound days of the 60s and 70s. Defensive formations like the Miami 4-3 had more and more success against triple option offenses. More offenses nationwide began favoring the passing game. More ground-based offenses began favoring the I formation, and there were less and less talented quarterbacks willing to run the option, highlighted by Troy Aikman's departure from Oklahoma in favor of the pass-heavy UCLA Bruins. The once dominant Wishbone became scarce. Its Flexbone successor would largely find its place among smaller schools as a means to punch above their weight. The Wishbone's use among major college teams was over, with one notable exception. Paul Johnson was about as well versed in the Flexbone as anyone could be, leading Georgia Southern to 2 FCS national titles and bringing Navy back from the dead with his mastering of the Flexbone, an expertise he'd bring with him to Atlanta in 2008. Johnson's Flexbone would prove just as deadly with Georgia Tech as it was with the Midshipmen and Eagles, propelling him to an inaugural 9-4 season along with ACC Coach of the Year honors. Then, a year later, Tech would go 11-3, earning both their first outright ACC title since 1990 and their first double-digit winning season since 1998. While far from the flashiest offense in the nation, Johnson would run a nearly perfect version of what the modern Flexbone could be. They'd run a collection of strong and shifty backs while making use of some of those same backs up front for added pass protection, giving Johnson's Yellow Jackets choices beyond the triple option. 5 years after their ACC championship run, they'd once again reach the 11-win mark in 2014, nearly toppling the defending national champion Seminoles and defeating Dak Prescott's Mississippi State Bulldogs in the Orange Bowl to cap Georgia Tech's miracle run. A few years later, and Paul Johnson would take his leave. Along with the Flexbone Renaissance he pioneered. A final salute to the legacies of Charles Kaysen, Bill Yeoman, Emory Bellard, and the Wishbone. I'd like to, again, thank my patrons: Zach, Sock, Ryan Brandenburg, Aura, Jack Hagman, Shane Bailey, Mantis Toboggan, Captain Coey, The King of War 541, William L. Jagnow, Aiden Wong, Yeah Avenue, Ryan Liu, Authentic Sims, Joe Sports 2022, Lance Justice, Class Jackson Lawsuit, Hoppe, October Rusto 2, Justin Pedraza, Cole, Nick Knudsen, Lurker, Trashcan Gus, Ease.L, Spicy Bape, The Erupturatan, Adrian Genge, Deatheros, Sean McWilliams, CC, The Hidden Source, Bradley Moore, at Signwood, Scarface 1, Mega Doomer, Philip, and Crosley Jones. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see y'all in the next video.